Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we begin a 4-day program on democracy dialogues. These are dialogues that we've been convening since nearly the beginning of Humanity Rising, as we were initially focused, of course, on the pandemic and the fact that public health around the world had entered into a code red situation. We also became aware that there are a number of code reds that are happening simultaneously, both in the United States and around the world. There's a code red in terms of climate. There's a code red in terms of democracy. And so as world events have unfolded, Humanity Rising has tried to delve very deeply into issues having to do with human renewal and regeneration and inspiration, but also we've delved into issues that are deeply challenging to all of us. Week before last, we heard from Black American men about what they have experienced in terms of the deep intractability of racism in the United States. So day by day and session by session, we're attuning ourselves both to what's happening, but also how we can take whatever crisis is before us and transmute it into an opportunity for a better world. Yesterday, we had Dr. Alyssa Epple on the program. She is the author of The Telomere Effect and is just publishing a book called The Stress Prescription, in which she looks at the escalating amount of stress that all of us are experiencing, wherever you are around the world. Every indicator of stress in our communities is dramatically escalating, from anxiety, depression, social withdrawal, drug abuse, domestic abuse, alcoholism, addiction, road rage. It's all going up everywhere. So her work is how you understand that and ameliorate it. And one of the articles that she's recently published is around politics, asking the question, are politics making you sick? And in fact, analysts are beginning to talk about headline stress disorder, that the political and ecological and just news out there is causing people to stress out so much that more and more people are stopping to watch the news and taking news fasts. Charles Eisenstein did that for, I think, 6 weeks a couple of months ago, and said he felt much better. Knowing that, we want to continue to dive into politics. We know this is stressful, particularly in the United States where there's such a crisis of democracy going on at so many levels. So at Humanity Rising, we don't take news fasts. We look the news right in the eye and do so in the confidence that if we delve into these issues in the spirit of truth pursued, not truth possessed, we will be illumined in ways that will inspire us to do more for a world so deeply in need. Before we dive into this program, let us pause, as we always do, to just breathe together. And in a moment, you're going to hear the sound of a bell. Those of you who are new, when you hear the sound of the bell, just breathe in for about 5.5 seconds. You hear another bell and just breathe out slowly. We're going to take 10 breaths together. According to science, breathing in this kind of coherent way is one of the most effective practices we can take up in a world of escalating stress. So thank you, everyone. Welcome. Let us breathe together, and then we'll begin our program. Thank you, everyone. It's always good to breathe as one in the spirit of what Plotinus said several thousand years ago, that the whole universe breathes as one. It's in this spirit that I am delighted to introduce my good friend and colleague, George Cappannelli, who's been a leading partner in the development of Humanity Rising, particularly as we now evolve Humanity Rising toward Humanity Rising Network, which we've discussed previously on many occasions when we'll be updating you soon again. George has been the one who has really carried the passion around the democracy dialogues and have recognized that this is a code red situation and that we need to do something about it in an enhanced way. So he's developed, I think, 35, 40 sessions now on democracy in Humanity Rising. It's a critical issue that affects all of us. And because if we don't have a democratic mechanism of discerning crises and challenges and resolving governance issues around what we need to do, we fail at the most fundamental task of ensuring the general welfare and the security of the future. So George, I want to welcome you to our program today and turn the session over to you.
Thanks, Jim, as always, really. It's always terrific to be here with you and with this audience. And I also want to welcome you on behalf of John Steiner and Margo King. John and Margo are co-collaborators in making this series possible. And I want to let you know that we are adding a word to the democracy dialogues, and that word is governance. So going forward, we're going to call it the democracy governance dialogues. We're doing that because the only thing you have to do is look around at the idiocy going on in the US Congress today on the Republican side, the dysfunctional Supreme Court, the mayhem that is going on in many of what are called the red states, at least in the legislatures, where pretty archaic laws and structures are being passed. So our job, I believe, is that we not only have to save democracy, but we have to revisit it. We have to redefine it for the 21st century. And above all, we have to strengthen it. That is, at least if we want it to survive and prosper. And if you need justification beyond what's happening, as Jim talked about, with the stress of never knowing when the next shoe is going to drop or what it's going to mean, then I think it would be helpful to take some guidance from a quote from Thomas Jefferson. And he says that once the people become inattentive to civic affairs, you and I and Congress and assemblies and judges and governors and certainly ex-presidents now belong on that list, all become wolves. And that's a pretty startling statement for one of the founders of our country. But unfortunately, I think it is true. So if you're out there sitting back and hoping and waiting that someone's going to make it better for you, I have a piece of advice. Stop waiting. The truth of the matter is, it's only when we become responsible citizens, it's only when we stay informed and engaged, no matter how challenging it is in this time to do that. Only in this way can we really make a difference in this time that we're living in. Only in this way, by having, as Jim said, a democratic process, even if at the moment it's kind of tattered and damaged in a lot of ways. The only way we can address those code red, those systemic problems of our time, is to be able to keep democracy functioning and improve its functioning, because it certainly is not perfect. So over the course of this week and others, we're going to invite a group of remarkable people who are out there with their sleeves rolled up, doing things of consequence to make a difference in these times. So if you aren't quite sure what you can do, then pay attention, stay with us this week and in future weeks, and let some of these brave and courageous and talented human beings be a guide, because they'll make a significant difference in what happens going forward, and you can make that difference along with them. Our topic this week is the battle to save democracy, and today, with part one, we're going to be joined by 3 guests initially and a 4th later. First of all, if I can invite Eleanor Lacane to come on in. Eleanor has been also a stalwart in these democracy dialogues, being with us on a number of occasions. She served as the Assistant Secretary of State in Massachusetts. She did a ton during the midterm in supporting secretaries of state all around the country. She's just devoted to this cause, and I'm delighted to have her join us. And I'm going to let Eleanor introduce the rest of the panel. So welcome, Eleanor.
Thanks so much, George, and thanks for all you do for democracy. I salute you, and I am thrilled with our program today. The purpose of our program today is to learn more about those threats to democracy and what we can do about them. We have 3 people joining us. First is Katie Usalis, who is the Partnership Director of Represent Women. Welcome, Katie.
Hi, thanks so much.
And secondly, with us, we have Bradley Onishi. And Brad has an amazing background. He's a former white Christian nationalist who just published a book about his experiences titled Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next. Welcome, Brad.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah. And Katie will be with us for the first segment. And as Katie steps off, we're going to welcome our next guest will be the wonderful Secretary of State in Colorado, Jenna Griswold. So let's get started with Katie. Now, Katie, you're working with Represent Women, which is dedicated to gender balanced representation at every level of government. It's already 2023, and we only have 28% of women in the US House. We have only 24% women in the Senate. So what's going on here? What are the barriers to greater and more equal representation? And what can we do to enable more women to serve in government?
Yes, great question. And I appreciate you shouting out those percentages, because every election cycle is another record-breaking year for women in office, which, you know, we want to acknowledge and celebrate, but the reality is we're looking at percentages in the 20s. So there's still a lot of work to do. So yes, Represent Women has been researching the barriers and the structural barriers and the structural solutions to gender balance in politics for about 6 years now. And we actually have found that, surprise, surprise, women face barriers across the entire political life cycle, from running to winning to serving and leading in their parties. And I will get into some specifics, but the bottom line is really that our current system was designed in a different time. It was designed by and for a very narrow demographic of people. So there's really no surprise that that very narrow demographic of people are the ones finding the most success in that system still today. But okay, so getting into some specifics, and I know we don't have too much time, so I will touch on some barriers in the running and serving and leading process, but I want to focus on our voting system. So yes, our research shows that women women have to work harder to raise money. So women are underfunded, especially Republican women are underfunded. And not only that, but they have to raise more money to actually win the race than male candidates. And also the legislative workplace, just as an employer, is not always a super attractive employer to have. Salaries are low, there's no on-site childcare, healthcare benefits are minimal, there's no proxy voting or telecommuting. So some legislators are driving, 12 hours to cast their votes and then drive back. And so even just the legislative workplace, it's not an easy place to work unless you have the resources and the access to a major support system back home who can help with the childcare needs, who can help with the salary needs and the healthcare needs and all those things. But yes, actually, our research shows that the main barrier to gender balance in politics is actually our entire voting system, which is called the winner take all or first past the post voting system. And this voting system creates three main barriers for women. And I can just list them off.
Just hit the highlights so we can weave Brad into the conversation.
Yes, happy to do that. So first of all, it promotes negative campaigns, which target women in more personal and violent ways. This is actually the number one reason why women say they won't run for office, me included. Secondly, it forces voters to choose the lesser of two evils, because voters are worried about wasting their vote if they vote for who they might really want, the woman candidate, for example, that if that candidate loses, their vote is wasted. So they have less choice and they have less voice in the matter. And also, since voters can only choose one candidate, parties are also incentivized to ask women to stand down because they don't want that woman candidate to pull votes away from the person that they think might actually win. So you'll see women are asked all the time to wait their turn or to drop out of the race. So that's it. Those are the three main ways that the current system just.
And I will say, part of why this is so important is the more women we have at higher levels in politics and government, the more power women have to fight back fascism, to fight back the hostility that's there, to stand up for the common good, to stand up for the families. So we need to get more women in more authority to help at every level in government. So you've identified the key structural barrier that, in spite of my entire lifetime for 50 years, we're trying to get more women in, and we're still at the 24% basically of pretty much every level. So you've got a big nut to crack here. What's your solution? Like, how do we change that, like remove that structural barrier so more women and people of color, I would say, would be able to vote?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a fact-based solution. That's the great news. We have hope. And in fact, it's being used in 50 to 60 jurisdictions across the country. It was used, extensively until the 1950s all around the US. And this is ranked choice voting. It's upgrading our voting system into a system that empowers voters with more voice and more choice. And when we see that happen, when we see voters not being afraid to waste their vote, and when we see parties not being afraid to split the vote, women win. Voters choose women candidates. Voters choose women of color, people of color. And I mean, that's just one of the ways ranked choice voting removes barriers. It also eliminates or decreases the incentives for negative campaigns, because candidates are competing for second place and third place rankings. So they have to appeal to a wider electorate. They have to bring more people into the fold. And in fact, with ranked choice voting, candidates will run as a collaborative, which is crazy. You'll see candidates running together and promoting their competition and saying, hey, I'm great, but you should rank them second because they're also really great and we have similar values and we have, we want to work on similar things. So if you don't like me, at least put them second. Which is amazing. I mean, it's just a game changer.
That's fantastic. I appreciate
can,
you going for solutions there, George.
Yeah, I just wanted to say there's another solution, of course, and that is for men and people around the country, women as well, to recognize the need for women's voices in leadership.
Yes.
Yeah. It's
Fantastic.
It's unconscionable that we have such a bipolar society that fails to address the fact that feminine aspect exists inside of every man as well as in women. And it's that balance, that counterbalance, that can make a huge difference in conscious leadership going forward. You know?
Yeah.
So true, George. And I'm noticing also Brad is nodding in agreement, which honestly I find fascinating, Brad. I mean, you came out of like, what was it, 11-year immersion in this white Christian nationalism, which is so deeply patriarchal and in my view, very anti-woman, anti-feminine.
Yep.
And yet here you are nodding at Katie saying, here's how we get more women and people of color into political power. What are you thinking as Katie is talking about the barrier and solutions?
Well, I think Katie's exactly right. I was enmeshed in that culture. I've been out of it for quite some time now. But what I've come to understand in my long journey politically and educationally is that the system was built for a very narrow group of people to have political power, economic power in this country. And I think as we work to update our voting processes, the ways that we structure elections, and the types of candidates who are able to run viably, all factors considered, we realize that the kind of work I do exploring white Christian nationalism, we realize the deep inheritance we have of a system that really was designed for white Christian landowning men to be elected. And so, as you mentioned there, Eleanor, you've had 5 decades of working in many ways to put forth more women candidates, and we just think of the ways that the system continues to need to be updated and in some cases revolutionized, so that people of color, so that folks who are immigrants, folks who are part of the LGBT community, mixed race folks. I mean, the system was not designed with them in mind. And so I think it's up to all of us as we think about protecting democracy, as we think about creeping fascism and proto-authoritarian impulses in our midst, that the kinds of work Katie's talking about is the kinds of work that all of us should be part of and realize is crucial to having democracy going forward.
That's great. And we're going to explore more in the last half hour of this program, Brad, how you came from being a preacher and teacher in white Christian nationalism to the level of consciousness that you just expressed so beautifully right there. And I can't wait to talk about that. But Katie's only got 5 more minutes with us here. And I just want to invite you, Katie, if there's anything else you want to say before you go. Maybe you want to give us an example of where ranked choice voting has worked. I mean, one of the things I love about it is this idea, when you have ranked choice voting, you can make elections more civilized because the candidate has the incentive to be nice to the other candidates because you want their people to vote for you as their second choice. So maybe you could explain a little bit more about how that works.
Yeah, sure. Ranked choice voting is the fastest growing reform in the nation. So we have a lot of examples to look at now, which is very exciting for us. So Oakland, California has been using ranked choice voting for several years now. And there's some great videos out there. I think it was the 2018 city council election. If you want to see a video of an actual campaign that there are 3 women of color running. And in our winner take all system, they would split the vote, and they would be told, you're going to split the vote for all the people who want to vote for women of color. So at least two of you need to drop out, and we can only have one. But because of ranked choice voting, they all could be on the ballot. They ran the campaign together. Literally in the video, the women are saying, hi, I'm so-and-so. This is my competitor. She's amazing. She's passed this legislation. She did this in her community. She did, really promoting each other. So that's a really great example to look at. Also, New York City in 2021, it's the largest municipal use of ranked choice voting. I mean, New York City is larger than most states in the country. So it's kind of a really exciting example to see ranked choice voting in action. And with ranked choice voting, they elected the first ever majority woman city council. They now have a 61% woman city council there, and the majority of those women are women of color. So it's New York City, it's actually representative of of the people there, which is really exciting. And we have some great quotes. You guys can go to our website, representwomen.org. We interviewed women candidates there who ran and talked so much about what a game-changing experience it was to know that the campaign was not going to be negative. It wasn't going to be violent. It wasn't going to be aggressive, especially for women of color. It wasn't going to be nasty and toxic, that it was going to be more civilized, and that they were going to have to collaborate. So in their decision to run, ranked choice voting influenced that. And then in their ability to win the race as well. The fact that they weren't going to split the vote and they weren't going to be told to wait their turn. So New York City is another great example.
Yeah, that's great examples. And I'm also thinking an entire country has done it. The country of Ireland, my ancestral home, the whole country does ranked choice voting. And I just learned the Academy Awards is now voting by ranked choice voting. So it's getting around. So you've been doing great work. And I'm noticing one of the commentators in the chat, Kat Haber from Alaska, says she absolutely witnessed a complete change in tone in the race in Alaska. So this actually really does work. And what does it take, Katie? We got to get the cities to vote for it, the states to vote for it. How do we get this adopted nationally faster?
That is a great question. Well, I think starting in cities and states is a great idea, creating this groundswell so that when it does go federal, when it does go national, everyone knows what's going on. Everyone's heard of it. Everyone's familiar with it. There is the Fair Representation Act in Congress right now, which is to pass ranked choice voting with multi-member districts and independent redistricting committees at the federal level. But get plugged in with your local movement. Fair Vote is an organization that has been around for like 30 years, and they've got a lot of state chapters. Rank the Vote is another great organization, and we're partners with all these groups. So we'll see you again if you connect with them. But just Google ranked choice voting and then your city and see what comes up, and get plugged in, because there's a lot of momentum, there's a lot of movement around it, and there's a lot of information out there.
Right. And thank you for posting in the chat for viewers. If you go to the chat roll, Katie has posted how to learn more information from the Represent Women website. So Katie, thank you so much for your great work. And thank you for being with us today. Really, really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to see all of you guys.
Good luck. I hope it's a good candidate you can hire.
Thank you. Me too.
All right. Bye. George, did you have any comment?
No, I think that it's clear that ranked choice voting, and it's clear that having more women in the political sector is really essential. I mean, it's like thinking through an issue with half the brain working, I mean, truthfully, you need both parts of the brain working. We need both dominant genders in whatever form that exists in humanity to be contributing. And I'm interested, as we wait for Jenna, I'm interested, Brad, I've read your work, and like Eleanor, I'm deeply impressed that you're willing to take this topic on and share your own experience in it. And I know we're going to talk about it in greater length in the final half hour. But while we wait for Jenna, maybe we could talk just a little bit about what was it like looking at life from the other side of this issue?
Well, we have Secretary Griswold is just joining us now. Welcome, Secretary Griswold.
Hi, everybody. How are you?
Good.
We're fabulous. We're excited you can join us. Thank you for being here.
Of course. Thank you for everything you guys do.
Yeah. And George had just asked Brad, is a former, this is Brad Onishi, by the way, a former white Christian nationalist. And this is Secretary of State of Colorado and the head of the National Democratic Association of Secretaries of State. Jenna Griswold, one of my favorite people in the world. I would say one of the great champions of democracy in our country. I can't think of anyone who's done more to support our democracy than Secretary Griswold. So thank you for all that you have done and continue to do. And George just asked Brad a powerful question, which may give you a little time to kind of clue into this conversation. And George basically asked, what was it like being a white Christian nationalist? So Brett, if you could give a very brief answer to that, we're going to circle back to that again more.
Sure. A lot to say, but what I'll focus on is the idea of uniformity. When it came to politics, the mantra in the community was that we all go the same direction. And if you're not willing to go the same direction, then you are no longer going to be in the community. What that means for democracy is that for many folks coming from this point of view, politics is rarely a dialogue or a debate. It's very much one army versus the other. And I think that mindset might help us understand why we see some of what many of us take to be anti-democratic forces brewing in our republic, whether that's on local levels or at the level of folks running for Secretary of State who are denying elections. So I'll just put that out there to start.
That's great. And Secretary Griswold, I think you did such an amazing job last year. Really, I was in awe. I mean, you ran for Secretary of State in Colorado and you won. Little did you know you had this train wreck coming down with the fascists, the election denier, and the threats that came. So if you could talk a little bit about just, briefly, like what happened last year with the Secretary of State races, and what do you think the key challenges to our democracy are now?
Well, first off, good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Eleanor. Eleanor has been a great partner in the fight for democracy. I just was reelected my second term. I ran for the seat in Colorado that a Democrat had not won in 60 years at the age of 32 against the only statewide Republican incumbent back in 2018, and we flipped the seat. And I think back then, no one knew what was coming, the extent of what was coming. I was concerned about some of the rhetoric coming from the president, the former president. Even when he was running for president, he was talking about, well, this election is going to be stolen. And then he gets into office. And if you recall, he's setting up a voter fraud in major air quotes. Commission trying to suss out things that didn't actually happen. We have the beginning of an indication that democracy is in for troubled times. And then 2020 hits, 2021, 2022, and fast forward through the pandemic, the death threats, the attacks on democracy, the attacks on election infrastructure, the whole host of bad things, voter suppression laws. Fast forward through all of that, 2022 hits, and we have election deniers running in every battleground state in this country to oversee our election infrastructure. Folks who do not believe in free and fair elections, saying they're gonna be the chief election officers as secretaries of state in Nevada, in Arizona, in Minnesota, Michigan, New Mexico. And that's aside from the voter suppressors. You have people trying actively to strip others of the right to vote. And then you go several steps further and you have in the realm of election deniers, fascists running to oversee battleground states. And ultimately, what was at stake in the midterms was American democracy. If you have an election denier overseeing the right to vote, the people will not be able to freely choose the president of the United States. So I was elected that election cycle chair of the Democratic Association of Secretaries of State, which is our campaign arm. And we built a committee that really used to have no staff, no money into a winning infrastructure. We ended up raising slightly over $30 million, and we defeated election deniers in every battleground state. I know this could be construed as Republicans versus Democrats. This is absolutely not what that is. It's Americans who believe in democracy, in the right to vote, in fundamental freedoms versus extremism. So we got over a major hurdle in the midterms. Thank God. I hope everybody is sleeping a little more sound, but we are absolutely not out of the woods. I do think, by the way, after the midterms, I am so much more optimistic about the future of this nation. I do believe we are going to defeat mainstream election denialism, the mainstream extremism that we are seeing corroding American politics and leading to real violence, real world violence.
Mhm.
But we're not out of the woods. And that's why we have to maintain our focus on the next 2 years.
Right. And I'm glad you mentioned that about that. First of all, hats off, all the election deniers running to get a hold of our state machinery. You helped defeat them all. So, and we as Americans defeated them all. So fantastic news. You're right. It makes you more hopeful of the country, and we're not out of the woods. One of the things I found most disturbing in the last election was not only the threats of violence, but the actual violence. And, look at what happened to Speaker Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi, attacked savagely in his own home. There was an orchestrated campaign to harass and intimidate election officials at all levels, including death threats and death threats to you. I mean, the guy who was threatening you got caught, thank God, when he was on his way to Colorado. So can you talk a little bit about what threats you experienced in Colorado and what you saw nationally with other election officials?
Sure. Yeah, the role of Secretary of State is a whole new thing. And it's a new position that state and federal government isn't prepared to protect, because at this point we need to protect secretaries of state and often election workers. So we saw for the last 4 to 6 years a coordinated effort to derail democracy. Voter suppression bills being passed, making it harder for Americans to cast a ballot. Massive disinformation campaigns from both our foreign adversaries, but domestic actors. Attacks on the actual election infrastructure. I had to address the first insider attack when a county clerk, so the local county administrator of elections, working with QAnon and the MyPillow guy, compromised her own voting equipment. We saw that spread across the nation. Then we also saw the threats to election workers. My personal experience is threats against me started June or July of 2011 when I took action to ban fake third-party audits. Colorado already has premier bipartisan audits. They're called risk limiting audits. They're really the best you can do. They've been adopted across the country. But what we were seeing, if you try to go through all the ridiculous scenarios this country has gone through in the last 2 years, 2021, we saw the ninja, what were their names? Ninja something or other in Arizona do this charade of an audit. And, if you allow unauthorized people access to voting equipment, what you have to do is get rid of all the voting equipment. And it costs a bunch of money. And it's being used to push out disinformation. So I issued an election order saying there will be no fake audits. There will be no unauthorized access to voting equipment in the state of Colorado. Number one, because I will decertify all the equipment and it's going to cost a lot of money. Number two, because county clerks are getting death threats for not allowing unauthorized access. So I did that. Congresswoman Lauren Boebert from the Western Slope of Colorado tweets out that I've stopped all audits in the state of Colorado. Totally untrue. And then Senator Ted Cruz does it, and then the death threats start. That was the beginning of death threats against me. We had no one reviewing threats. I had no security. State Patrol at that time was not reviewing. Since 2021, I've received hundreds and hundreds of threats. Things like, what's the size of your neck? I want to know before the noose, I'm going to string you from the tree. You shouldn't go to sleep. I'm gonna come kill you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you realize that number one, it's not actually about me as a person. It's trying to intimidate folks who are defending our democracy. But number two, once you're in the middle of a national QAnon conspiracy that's bonkers and people are telling you over and over how they're going to come kill you, you have to take action. And in 2021, the nation wasn't thinking about this, honestly. So I was forced to push out a national conversation about the threats to make sure that we could get adequate security, to make sure secretaries in other states could get adequate security. It's ongoing. We continue. There are secretaries who do not have the security they need, where we are, folks have had to take their families out of their houses because of these threats. And it basically is an impediment to doing your job when you can't look over your shoulder every second as an elected official. So what I did was a couple of things. We started tracking the threats and sending them to federal and state authorities. I started to pay out of some federal funds security while I had passed a law to get more regular state patrol protection. So I'm in a much better spot. But when I say we're not out of the woods, the violent rhetoric has led to Paul Pelosi's attack, the kidnapping attempt of Gretchen Whitmer, and most recently, the insurrection. Yeah, the governor of Michigan, the insurrection where police officers were killed. And most recently, in December, the shooting up of 6 elected officials' houses in New Mexico. A guy running for county commissioner, election denier, hired 2 men to go after elected officials. Bullets came through one of the commissioner's little girl's room, into her room. And she woke up in the middle of the night and said, "Mommy, why is there dust on me?" And it's because the bullets hit the sheetrock and the dust was falling on her. The extreme rhetoric leads to violence. But not only that, the failure of Republicans to condemn extreme rhetoric leads to violence. They are creating an atmosphere where this is okay. And, you know, I think it was last week, an interview of the Speaker of the House, McCarthy. And he said something along the lines, it was on one of the big news stations. He said something along the lines of, well, maybe it's good for these election deniers to have leadership in the House committees because they can get answers to their questions. Well, their questions are not real questions. They're lies. And it's destabilizing American politics. And it's the reason that a little girl has bullets running through her bedroom. And honestly, we have to condemn the election deniers, the extreme rhetoric, but also people like Speaker McCarthy, who have allowed folks in his party the atmosphere where they can even push out this extremism. So that's why I say we're not out of the woods, but we will be out of the woods. And I hope we get a chance to talk about that.
Jenna, if we may, you weren't on before, but one of the things that we talk about a lot on the Democracy Dialogues is that there is a great responsibility that citizens have that to a large extent they're not exercising. And so as you say what you have just said, I want to point out to our viewers that unfortunately, a lot of us cast our ballots in good faith, and then we go on about our business, and we leave people like you and all of our elected officials on their own to fight and struggle against something to a large extent that's unconscionable. So I just want to remind our viewers that we have an obligation when McCarthy or Boebert or whoever it is says something or does something, we have to speak up. We have to let people know that we're unwilling as citizens of this country to let that stuff continue. Because by yourselves, no matter how much good you do, which is a lot of good, you're left undefended and unsupported. Democracy only works when we, the people, work it. So I just want to make that point and then say, what do we do next?
Well, George, I think that is absolutely right. But I do think Americans are stepping up. You just see the midterm results. We stopped election deniers in every battleground state, Wisconsin also, Pennsylvania, states that would have put in peril the ability for the American people to choose their president. You know, Democratic secretaries of state and what should be all secretaries of state, our job, even though we're largely elected on party lines, is not to help one party over the other. It's to ensure the American people, Republicans, Democrats, unaffiliated, rural, big city folks, no matter the color of your skin, your zip code, it's to allow the American people to choose their elected officials. That's really what this is all about. And ultimately, look, the Secretary of State candidate who was not an election denier won in Nevada. The Democratic governor lost. Secretaries of State outperformed the top of their ticket in Michigan, Nevada, Arizona. Here in Colorado, I was the first Democrat elected in 60 years, but I was also the first incumbent to win re-election in 20 years, right? So I think one of the things going into the midterms is that a lot of the national commentators thought that Americans didn't care enough about democracy. That is totally untrue. The big headline coming out is that Americans saved democracy, and it's not Democrats alone. It truly isn't. It's Republicans, unaffiliated, and Democrats rejecting the extremism. With that said, there are now, it's not over. There's 150 election deniers in the US House. There's about 5 or 6 in the US Senate. There are a handful of election denier secretaries of state where we could not, there just wasn't competitive races. So Wyoming, South Dakota, Florida, there was one in Texas. I think he's about to get replaced just because they tend to replace their secretaries of state pretty often. Indiana. So it's not over. And I think there's a couple things that we need to do. And the reason I think we're going to win this fight is it's not about the conspiracies, it's about power. And there are national strategists sitting in DC, sitting in Mar-a-Lago, thinking about how do we take these elections even if we don't win? How do we manipulate? How do we undermine? How do we litigate ourselves into power without actually winning? This is a political strategy. And there are some true believers, there truly are. But the folks at the top, they don't believe that Hugo Chavez rose from the dead to work with a Spanish company to steal servers and take them to Germany, and all the gobbledygook that makes zero sense. They don't believe it. It's about power. So there's a couple of things we have to do. Number one, strengthen our laws and prosecute. Strengthen our laws and prosecute to make sure folks, number one, there's a lot of places where laws are not on the books. When we had our insider threat, when Tina Peters compromised her own voting equipment, there was no felony saying you can't compromise your own voting equipment. There was no felony saying you can't allow unauthorized access or you can't post the passwords online. So what did I do? Well, I addressed the situation, and then I led the first law in the nation on insider threats. All of that is now a felony, and we have whistleblower protections to make sure whistleblowers are good to come forward, and provided over $1 million to the counties to increase their security. So we need to strengthen our laws. We then need prosecutors to do their job. And in the Mesa County situation, it's a red county, predominantly red county, a Republican prosecutor, and he's prosecuting her because that is his job, to make sure that people follow the law. That trial starts in about a month. We need to strengthen our laws. We need to prosecute. We need secretaries of state to use their executive authority to address these bad situations. We also need to win the battle of communication. When someone says the stuff isn't safe, we need to say, it is safe, this is why, and you are an election denier trying to destroy this country. We may not win in the courts, the whole fight, but we have to win the battle for the soul of the country. We need to make sure when there are lies, there's someone refuting it, so good information comes out, because democracy relies on facts. Democracy relies on information. Strengthen laws, prosecute, push back truth to the disinformation, and beat the election deniers every race we can. Election denialism has no role in the United States. It is a danger to American democracy. We have to defeat them. And then lastly, tied to communication, we have to ask ourselves, well, how the heck did this get mainstream in the first place? How the heck is that even possible? That at this point, there is so much distrust. And if you take a couple steps back, the answer is folks who grew up like me in a cabin with an outhouse outside on food stamps do not believe their government works for them. And their government largely does not work for them. So we have to also recommit ourselves to democracy and recommit as a people the understanding that democracy is the only thing that pulls us forward. A fascist government does not care about blue-collar workers. An authoritarian government does not care about the middle class. The only way we have ability to send kids to school and not to go into six-figure debt, to get healthcare, affordable housing, clean water, is a functioning democracy. So that also means the larger picture is recommitting ourselves to democracy reform, stopping the voter suppression, opening up access, stopping gerrymandering, making sure that people have a voice in campaign finance reform, getting the corruption, the corrupted dark money out of our politics. So I think that sounds like a big task, and it's incremental. It's not going to happen overnight. But I do think we win the battle for the soul of this country, because we just won in the midterms. And by we, I'm talking about the American people, in defeating what was a major threat to the future of this nation.
That's fantastic, Jenna. Thank you for laying out what it is to be done. I mean, it's big, but so was going to the moon, and we in America did that. So, and you're right, we won, we beat back all running for Secretary of State last year. So we can do what you've laid out. I want to ask Brad here, because Brad, as a former white Christian nationalist, you actually knew some of these people who were at the January 6th insurrection. These were people in your church, and you certainly are aware of the ways of thinking. And now you've come out of that, and you really have a much more clear idea of what reality is. What advice do you have? Like, you know this mindset, you know this way of life. Is there anything we can do to help defang these crazy, I think they're crazy, white Christian nationalists who are like stomping on our democracy and turning to violence for the explicit goal of putting white Christians in charge of everything, everywhere, at every level of our government? How do we stop them, or how do we change their thinking? What do you recommend?
Well, I just want to follow up on something that Jenna said there about democracy runs on facts. And no matter how closed your worldview, no matter how straight the lines you think lead to truth, no matter how many conspiracies you've been told in the service of power, there's always going to be points in your life when the reality, the messy reality of the human condition and of living with other human beings in a democracy is going to bump up against that closed worldview. And in those moments, there's a chance for communication. But what Secretary of State Griswold said, I think, is really important. That communication has to be very clear. And it has to be communication that relays the fact that the moral outrage does not come from one direction. The white Christian who believes they have the unilateral right to the country and to its elections. The moral outrage comes from the American people who say, how dare you? How dare you question our sacred values? We're in a covenant with each other, not just Christians with one another. We're in a covenant as American people, and we have protected our elections to the best of our ability. And you have no evidence, and you have no data that shows us otherwise. And so how dare you question those sacred values? And you really need to sort of reconsider what you're saying here, because you're the one who's out of line. And I can tell you, it's coming from this kind of community, the sense of having the moral high ground by default is built in, because as a white Christian in this country, you take yourself to be the standard American. How could you ever be anything but the heir of the founders? And so I just really appreciate what Secretary of State Griswold said about clear communication regarding the sacred value of democracy, because there's always a chance that even in the most closed worldview, people will have a moment of breakthrough and clarity.
Brad, if I may, and Jenna, I don't know where you sit on this topic, but I think it would also be helpful for us to revisit the tax deferments of most churches in America, whether they're white Christian nationalists or any other. I think that there is significant abuse and significant undercutting of democracy that are happening today in nonprofit organizations that are given tax exemptions in the United States. If they're going to be political organizations, they should be so named. That's one thing that I would hope would happen. And the other is, thanks to people like you, honestly, your work is helping us to better understand and to call it for what it is. The avoidance of the fact that the intention is to create an exclusive white Christian nation is not talked about enough in the political spectrum.
Yeah, and I want to underscore something Secretary Griswold said, which is for the fascists, when they get power, don't care about the middle class or low income. They're just being used to get the power. And it was Madeleine Albright in her book about fascism pointed out, said fascism is an ideology like, democracy or communism. Fascism is all about a power grab. It's just about getting power. And then whoever the tyrant is that's in control can do whatever they think whatever they want to do, and you can't stop them. So I think pointing out to people, maybe, I don't know if that would be helpful, but pointing out about how they're being used for that may be something that could be help to drain the swamp of the white Christian nationalists and the neo-Nazis. And really, because they just had in the paper today about neo-Nazis captured, planning to blow up our system in Baltimore, Maryland. And this has been happening throughout the Northwest. And like, what do they hope to achieve by, I guess what their goal is to create chaos and maybe start a race war. But these threats are real, they're ongoing. I'm so grateful, Jenna, for everything that you've done and continue to do, and your leadership and your guidance and your courage in the face of personal death threats and everything else. You were just steady through the storm. And I'm so grateful for you and appreciative, and want to support you and listen to your guidance of what we as Americans can do to keep our democracy, which is very much still under attack.
Well,
Jenna,
thank you for yes, sir.
I was just going to say, I know you're only with us for a few minutes. I was going to see if you wanted to say anything more before you depart.
1 minute.
Oh, okay, 1 minute. You guys are prompt.
Well, no, you can stay as long as you want. We're here another half hour.
Well, I just wanted to say, Eleanor, thank you. Everybody who joined, please just thank you so much. George is exactly right. None of us can defend democracy alone. This is absolutely a team effort. This is not Democrat versus Republican. This is not neighbor versus neighbor. This is Americans versus extremists. And Eleanor touched on a really important word, chaos. Chaos. It is about creating chaos. It's about creating fear and instability in people's hearts so that they think that a democratic system does not work. It's about trying to destabilize the country. But ultimately, chaos is not good. It is chaotic. It is a place where human rights are not respected, where fundamental freedoms are not respected, where people's dignity is not respected. And it's not only about, authoritarianism, not good for working people or the middle class. It's not good for anybody. People of color, people from different ethnic groups, people who are any type of, folks, it is not good. And ultimately, it's not good for white men either. Because if you do not have rule of law, if you do not have a government where we basically agree to the rules of the game, then things are thrown out the window. The foundation of this country is that we agree to disagree in a civil way. We agree to disagree at the ballot box. We agree to disagree in legislative disagreements in state legislatures and in Congress. But we agree that we put aside political violence for the vote. And, every election cycle, folks have a chance to get their candidates in, and then they agree to disagree. And the last thought, a couple of last thoughts. One of the reasons I'm so hopeful is that, number one, we stopped the election denialism in the midterms, but there are so many good Republicans stepping up. I ran against a man, his name's Wayne Williams, in 2018, who was the sitting Secretary of State. I disagreed with him enough to run against him, and I won. Wayne Williams accepted appointment to oversee Mesa County's elections when an election denier compromised their voting equipment. He has stood up time and time and time again for the Colorado election model. Colorado Clerks Association, predominantly Republicans, have joined me in fixing the law, putting those felonies in place, holding bad people accountable. The Clerks Association is led by a former Republican clerk. Majority of its members are Republican. So the big takeaway from all of this is we are not out of the woods. We absolutely are on the right path. We have to remain steadfast in our rejection of fascism, authoritarianism, the lies. Like Eleanor says, folks in my position, that we need your help. We need you to stay engaged. And ultimately, I do believe we are going to defeat this once it becomes a losing proposition for the Republican national strategists. So thank you guys. Thank you guys for having me. Thank you for all of your support. And I'm looking forward, hopefully in 2 years, to say Americans again rejected extreme candidates and we're on a more stable path for the country. So thank you so much.
Well, we salute you and support you, and we're with you all the way, Jenna. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good one.
So, Brad, I'm very curious now. We've been talking a lot with Secretary Griswold about the white Christian nationalists driving a lot of this violence and attack. To me, that just seems so unchristian. Like, wasn't Christ against violence? And can you help us understand, what are these people thinking? Like, how do they make sense of this when they profess to be Christians, God-fearing, God-loving people? And they're out there, they're dissing women, they're dissing people of color, they're literally attacking our elected official, they're promoting fear, they're being violent and overrunning our US Capitol, our government. How does that make sense to them? Can you explain that?
It's obviously confounding, but let me offer just a few, thoughts that might help us get into it. Christian nationalism is really a cultural identity. And I think that's really important to realize. One does not have to read the Bible or go to church all the time to be what we might call a Christian nationalist. A Christian nationalist is very simply somebody who thinks that because of America's founding as a Christian nation, and that's their words, not mine, that Christianity should be privileged in the public square going forward. And that can mean in politics, that can mean in economics, that can mean in culture. They believe the country was built for and by Christians. Other people can be here. People of color can be here. Immigrants can be here. But they're always going to need to know their place. The country wasn't built by them. Country wasn't built for them. And so if that order gets out of whack, if things are no longer in the hierarchical way that they should be, with white Christians, white patriarchal Christians, it could be women like Lauren Boebert who are running for office, but they need to be women who recognize that women are subject to men in some way. Patriarchal, white, Christian, native born, speaking English, and straight, heterosexual, then if that order gets out of whack, they feel as if their entire country has been stolen because they're the supposed founders of the country. And they have this very apocalyptic view of the future, that if they don't act quickly, the country will no longer exist and it will be stolen out from under them. So when they hear in 2020 that the election has been stolen, it doesn't just pertain to one election. It really resonates with what they take to be 50 or 60 years of women, people of color, Black Americans, LGBT Americans, mixed race Americans, immigrants, since the 60s, making progress where they have rights and representation in ways that have often been denied to them. Well, for the Christian nationalists, it feels like 60 years of stealing from them what is rightfully theirs. And so their political opponents are no longer just opponents. They're no longer just, hey, I disagree with you on how we should approach this economic issue. They are enemies. They're enemies of the United States. And so that next step, when your political opponent is an enemy and not simply someone with whom you disagree, well, I think violence is a logical next step, and that's kind of how we get there in today's world.
George?
Well, my question is, in some ways, internalized and integrated belief systems are really the underpinnings of every cult, every religion in the world. So the question becomes, for an example, what caused you to move from one belief system to another? How did that happen in terms of your life?
You know, when I converted at age 14, I found very quick and absolute answers to life's most fundamental questions. And as I grew older, I ran into, as I mentioned earlier, the complexities of the human condition and the complexities of living in the world as an adult. And that is what sort of provided the opening pathways for me to question that very closed worldview. And there were a couple of political moments that stick out. There were a couple of instances where I had contact with people that I had been told would be evil or would be trying to hurt me. And in fact, were wonderful, life-affirming, and incredibly smart and caring human beings. So I guess my point is this, is that the contact with those outside of that closed worldview plays an incredibly essential role. And it provides an opportunity for people to see past the rhetoric, past the propaganda, and past the lies. And so what I always tell folks is that, you know, it's not always possible to be in a safe relationship with somebody in your life who maybe has gone down QAnon rabbit holes or extremist rabbit holes. But if you can be, if it's your cousin or your nephew or your friend or your colleague, you can still get coffee, you can still do things together, talk at the family barbecue. Asking them how they feel rather than what they believe is a much more effective pathway. Because if you ask them why they're angry, why they're resentful, why they're anxious, they might actually tell you. And then you might actually get to tell them why you feel the same way. The code red, the red alert that we discussed earlier. And all of a sudden you won't be the demonic, godless heathen that they were told in church that you are. You'll just be a human being who's also scared and also anxious and also trying their best to make a better future. And all of a sudden their worldview is pierced. All of a sudden that closed bubble has openings and they can see for a minute past everything they've been told. And I think that's a real good start.
You know, and that's so much what the strategy is. If they say you're kidnapped by people who might kill you, the strategy is to communicate with the kidnapper, somehow make yourself human to them, like look them in the eye and talk about your children and, you know, just humanize yourself as quickly as you can. And it sounds like that's what you're recommending we do with our fellow Americans who are kind of off the rails in a big way and threatening it for the rest of us. So I appreciate that guidance. And I'm wondering, Brad, your book, by the way, I just want to, for people who are watching the show, the book is fabulous, Preparing for War. It's the title, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism, What Comes Next. I am very curious, Brad, if you could explain to us briefly here, we've seen this unfold and most of us were shocked by it, but you see it as a 50-year lead up to this moment. What do you see is coming next? You're the inside track, you knew these people. What should we be watching for now?
Well, I want to pick up on something that Secretary of State Griswold said about the lies about elections and the election denial. When she said that, you know, what my mind really raced to was the fact that this was a 60-year process. And part of the reason I wrote the book is I wanted folks to realize that what happened in the 2020 election with election denial had been in the works for 6 decades. That there's been a recognition that the fewer people who vote, that the better certain folks do in the country. And that's what they want. That if there is suspicion about government, whether it's schools, whether it is governmental processes, whether it's elected officials, the better some people do. And so, you know, these things have been in the works for a long time, and the demonization of the process has been in the works for a long time. So I just want to make that clear that this is a strategy. And it's not one that started with Donald Trump. It started a long time ago, going back to the 1960s. I also just really appreciate the ways that Secretary of State Griswold expressed relief in the wake of the 2020 midterms, because as somebody who studies these things for a living, I was incredibly worried. I saw who was on the ballot for Secretary of State. I saw who was on the ballot for governor in Pennsylvania and in Arizona. And what she said is something that I think happened. Americans made democracy a kitchen table issue, and they realized that voting for democracy was something they had to do alongside voting for lower gas prices or anything else. And we need to continue to make that a reality. However, I also agree that this fight is not over. And I think for me, as somebody coming from a former insider perspective, I can tell you that, as I try to lay out in the book, 60 years of organizing is not going to stop because there were some disappointing results in a midterm cycle. You know, the folks who are doing this kind of work are not going to say, well, it didn't go as great as we thought. Maybe we should just pick up a new hobby and get on with our lives. That's not how it works. And I think this points to one last thing I'll say is, this is why the Christian element of this is so powerful. The religious element provides a cosmic dimension. It says that, yeah, the victory may not be won in your lifetime, but you're fighting for something that goes well beyond you, and therefore it's worth it just to keep going. And I don't think we can overlook that the cosmic and existential dimensions of the narrative, they really inspire people to keep fighting, even though it may seem that, you know, things may not ever change in their lifetime. And that's something that has to be taken account for going forward. So I am breathing a sigh of relief, like the Secretary of State. I am also continue to be deeply worried because this fight is not over. And I could point to even more instances of violence and chaos that have already been mentioned, because there are unfortunately more and more examples that we could point to in our midst every day.
Well, Brad, I really thank you again for the perspective that you bring and share. There's not enough of that. And whenever those of us who are not as wedded to one belief system or another are able to understand and feel that, the seriousness of the threat, I think, is really something that the rest of us have to pay attention to. It's not something we can just deal with every 2 or 4 years. We have to deal with all along. The fact that there are so many people in Congress and in the Senate and on the Supreme Court and in states around the country who acknowledge and support that point of view is something we also have to pay a lot more attention to. Because until recently, across the course of those 60 years, even though all of that was fermenting under the surface, political figures did not come out blatantly and endorse and support that. So while it didn't begin with Trump in the 2016 election, it certainly added a new factor that we have to be aware of. And until we find a way to eliminate that factor from people who supposedly are elected to uphold the Constitution of the United States, we're going to remain in trouble. We have no trouble when we talk about that segment of the Muslim faith that are called terrorists in other countries. But we have a lot of trouble recognizing what we are truly dealing with here in the United States. And so I just want to encourage you to keep doing the work that you're doing and also humanizing, because the thing I think that causes a lot of trouble is when we start demonizing each other and we give up those opportunities at a barbecue or a family gathering to talk to one another. A friend of mine is a poet by the name of Mark Nepo, and he says, what we reach for may be different, but what makes us reach is the same. And if we could do more of that, and if you could help us do more of that, that would be really terrific.
Yeah. I think that's really important, and I salute and support you, Brad, in what you're doing. And I'm glad to interview you on my radio show and have this conversation here to help you get that out. I hope everybody here buys and reads your book, Preparing for War. I wanted to circle back to something you mentioned, that the white Christian nationalists see this as 50 years of women and people of color kind of getting advantages and making progress, and at their expense. They see it as a zero-sum game. It isn't that women can advance and people of color can advance and they can too. It's like, no, it's like the zero-sum game, which it really isn't. I mean, we can all advance, we can all do better. Clearly there's misogyny there, clearly there's racism there, and that whole deep, dark undertone that's been in our country, unfortunately, since its founding. But I'm just wondering, there's Dr. Maura Conlon in the chat has asked, is this the patriarchy at its last gasp? How much of what the white Christian nationalists are doing is a blowback for the progress that women and people of color have made? And what do we do about that?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. What I would add is that it's the last gasp. Going across, I think, several dimensions. It's a patriarchal last gasp. It's a sense that white people are under a threat. It's a sense that Christian people are under a threat. So it's a sense that, and I was just teaching this to my class the other day. There's a very real sense that if LGBT folks are extended rights and representation and treated equally under the law and as human beings in society, then somehow that persecutes the straight Christian person. And I know that sounds ludicrous to everyone on the call here today and everyone watching, but that is the logic. So it's the last gasp of people who are so convinced that if the social order changes in any way, that they will be not just needing to adjust to a new context, but that they will be persecuted, they will be threatened, and that their way of life will be completely upended. And this is something I talk about quite often. Lauren Kirby, in a book called Saving History, talks about how this group of people really toggles back and forth between thinking of themselves as the founders of the country. We are the ones who are the rightful heirs, and we are the country's most prominent victims. It's either founder or victim, because as the founders, if you get in the way of our unilateral control over the social order, then we are the victims of persecution. My colleague always says that it's easy to think that when everyone is treated equally, everyone has equal rights, we all win. But for the white Christian nationalists, the thought is, when you get more rights, I lose part of the pie. Mm-hmm. It's not that the heart grows bigger in our republic, it's that my piece of the pie grows smaller. And so I'm going to look at it that way. I'll just add one more thing, and that is that there's a sense that comes along with being the founders of the country, that using violence as the founders of the country is legitimate from you. That if you use violence to put things back in order the way they should be, it's legitimate, it's necessary, and it's even God ordained. If anyone else does it, if there are protests, if there are uprisings after the murder of George Floyd, if there are protests after the overturning of Roe v. Wade, it's not legitimate. It's in fact a threat to the rightful social order, and it needs to be squashed as soon as possible. So violence is a real key here, because it tells you who has the rightful authority to the country and who doesn't. And in the mind of the white Christian nationalists, only one group has the right to maintain order through violence, and that is them. And so long answer here, is it the last gasp of patriarchy? Yes, and last gasp are often quite scary because they are the last measure of survival, and it means anything is possible when it comes to the reaction.
Brad, I'm gonna in a minute just ask Jim if he'll come in, because I know he'll have his perspectives on this, and I'd like to hear what he has to say. The last point you made is so fundamentally important for all of us to understand, so that we don't misrepresent the severity and the consequences of this experience. Someone asked Kurt that that quote was by Mark Nepo, that what we reach for may be different, but what makes us reach is the same. Jim.
Well, what a extraordinary session between presenters here today. Thank you so much, Eleanor and George, for putting such a diverse group together. It was so heartening to hear from Jenna Griswold about the fact from her point of view, we actually made it through the hump. And even though there's work to be done, we can, I guess, be satisfied or acknowledge that we did a lot of work in the last election. And George, I want to just acknowledge your passion and everything that you did in the lead up to the 2022 election as part of that larger effort. And it's within that context, Brad, I would love to hear your insight into what appears to be a growing split now between the evangelical Christians and Donald Trump. It seems as if, you know, he kind of shot his wad with the 22 election. It didn't work out. And there's a growing sense that his star is fading. But you also have, you know, equally radical and younger people like DeSantis in Florida who are carrying on the torch. So I would love to hear how you're assessing the trajectory of Trump right now in relationship to the evangelicals, someone like DeSantis. And as we look toward the 24 election, what do you see are the fault lines that we need to be tracking?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for asking that question. I want to underscore something that was said earlier by both Eleanor and Secretary of State Griswold, that the sacred value here is power. It's not democracy, and Trump looks weak. I think we're in a moment of liminality. You know, the power brokers are trying to push their chips behind the scenes towards certain players. Some of the mega church pastors and those with big influence are trying to take the heat of the winds and where they're blowing, and they're kind of waiting. But I will be honest, if Trump looks weak and is not the viable candidate, evangelicals, white Catholics, Pentecostals, they will move to DeSantis or whoever is, because the goal is power. And as long as that person promises them that he, and it will most likely be a he, will carry out their program, will advance their goals, then they will go with that person. And so what I see going forward is someone like DeSantis is much less bombastic and spectacular than Trump. He does not have whatever it is Trump has on the campaign and rally stages in terms of the spectacle. But he's a much better governor. And what I mean by that, don't misunderstand me, folks, is he knows the levers of governance. He knows how to pull them and push them. He knows how to get things passed. And so what I see in DeSantis is a candidate who can carry on Trumpism without Trump in a way that might be more terrifying, because he is actually competent in the forms of governance and can get things executed, whereas Trump largely was inexperienced and incompetent in this way, and really only got a few things passed and through that were available. DeSantis is already showing us he sees the playbook. If I run to the right of Trump on COVID, vaccines, on education, on gender and sexual rights and representation, that's a winning strategy. He came out with a campaign ad that said, on the 8th day, God made a warrior, Ron DeSantis. And he really fashioned himself as the new harbinger of the religious rights, values, and goals and the godly warrior they need. He knows the playbook, and he's already running it. And so I think we're going to get Trumpism without Trump if we don't have Trump as a viable candidate. And the evangelicals, and I'm never going to leave out the white Catholics because they voted for Trump in majorities both times, they will shift to someone like DeSantis, who is even further to the right on most issues, totally willing to advance their agenda, and maybe even more competent as a legislator and a politician than its predecessor.
And just a final question, because I know that we're at the outer limits of our time here, but there's also speculation. We've had other people on Humanity Rising who have gone through the thicket of Christian fundamentalism. And their view is that the young generation, the Gen Zs and the alphas that are emerging, are not adhering to the fundamentalist notion in anywhere near the numbers necessary for this constituency to survive as it currently is, so that you have in the United States, as an example, more and more people of color.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The white demographic is receding slowly but inexorably. And you also have this phenomenon that this emerging generation of that white demographic is not going along with the program in the kind of numbers necessary to keep it a critical mass. Is that your view? Do you have a different point of view as you assess the power of this base and how it's evolving over time?
No, I think from a demographic perspective, it's true. It's a graying group, and it's a group that's having a hard time convincing their young people to stay with the program.
Yeah.
The one piece of caution, though, I want to give is that I think, whenever I've talked about this, there's folks who said, well, the new generation will save us. Young people will save us just by dint of being young, and they will see through this rhetoric. And I think in many ways that is true, that Gen Z and alphas, they just don't buy into the homophobia and the xenophobia in ways that they're being taught. However, I just make 2 points. One is Christian nationalism is really a cultural identity. And so people can adopt it at later points in life by way of talk radio. I'm thinking of like all the white men in the 90s who were radicalized by Rush Limbaugh. My stepfather never really went to church, but Rush Limbaugh made him into this really angry political guy. And he really fit the bill of like, this is a Christian nation. And he had a lot of, things to say about all the groups that you can imagine. So I think that can be adopted. Christian nationalism can be adopted by people through various channels and at various times in life. So I'll just point out that in high school, I was the one who was incredibly devoted to his faith. And when I go and see my friends from back home these days, many of them who had no interest in religion or politics or values or faith or any of these things that I was always talking about, they're now the ones raising their kids, and all of the memes on their social media, all of the messages they're sending out are about a Christian country and a this and that and old-fashioned value. And you can see the person in their 40s, right, or their late 30s, going from that person who was not religious to, well, I'm raising kids and talk radio, and all of a sudden they're this person with this political agenda you never saw coming, or maybe you did, but you didn't expect, or you didn't know before. And so I just want to caution people that just because young people see through this, everyone gets older. People come to this by different means, and we shouldn't just let that be a kind of way that we rest on our laurels and say, well, we're obviously going to be okay because the young folks are going to save us.
Well, this is the point that Carl Jung makes, is that this balance between the light and the dark, between good and evil, is eternal. And it manifests itself in different ways depending on the social contours and opportunities and constraints of any given generation. And that's why, back to your original statement, George, about the wolves, democracy has to be preserved generation by generation. We'll never get to that point where, that we're at the end of the yellow brick road. I think it's a very important point that you're making, Brad. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So, Eleanor, as always, deep appreciation and thanks. Brad, very grateful to you for your participation. Come back and join us. We'll have other conversations we'll need to have.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Jim, want to talk just briefly about tomorrow before we wrap up? It's the second day in this battle for the well-being of democracy. And tomorrow we're going to have Billy Wimsatt and his team from the Movement Voter Project, who played such an incredible role in 2022 and are on path to do the same thing. And I opened with a quote by Jefferson. I just want to close with one by Eric Hoffer, who says, no matter how noble the objectives of a government, if it blurs decency and kindness, cheapens human life, and breeds ill will and suspicion, it is an evil government. So we need to remember that about both what we think of the good guys and the not so good guys, because some of that shadow exists inside of all of us. And we just need to hold everybody's feet to the fire and do what we need to do to be conscious, responsible human beings. So, Jim, thanks for the opportunity as always.
Thank you, George. And before we close, Eleanor, I just want to take a moment and acknowledge your life and the fact that for decade after decade, you've been on the front line fighting for women's rights and democracy in the United States, and all the offices you've held and the persistence of your will over time. So I just want to take a moment to acknowledge you and to thank you for everything that you've done. You know, Brad, you're still young and a warrior. Eleanor's been at it for a long time and is still keeping on. So maybe Eleanor, and by the way, Brad, I'd love to have you back to tell more details of just your story.
Yeah,
that would be wonderful, and I think very informative. So I'll be in touch with you.
okay.
But Eleanor, why don't you give us just a final word as we wrap up for today, knowing that we acknowledge and deeply thank you for everything that you've done.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate that Lifetime Achievement Award. It's an honor and a privilege to participate with you and George in these democracy dialogues, and all the people who come, the guests and the people in the chat room, the people listening. We're at such a critical time in our country and the world right now, and I still feel very hopeful about what's happening. I was very anxious last year. I did jump in both feet, as Secretary Griswold mentioned, shoulder to shoulder with her to defeat those 11 election deniers running for Secretary of State. We defeated 11 out of 11, so hallelujah for that. Even in the last month, I jumped into New Hampshire to try and defeat election deniers running for the House and the Senate there. And I never thought I'd go back in the field the way I did for 14 hours a day, but it needed to be done. And there were millions of people like me around the country. It's like, say, kitchen table, democracy, an issue. We have to step up. To George's point, everyone's got to jump in if we want to save our country. So I want to give a special thanks to my three friends who came today. Brad, and your incredible book. I hope everyone reads your book. Secretary Griswold is one of my heroes, and I am happy to support her in any way that we can and follow her great leadership. And also Katie, initially talking about Represent Women, if we can get more women in from Represent Women, get more women into office at every level, I think it can help. They're not all great. I mean, we've seen some awful women, but most of the women tend to want to bring the temperature down and take care of the families and the communities. So I'm with you all, shoulder to shoulder, to help save democracy in America, beat fascism worldwide, and deal with all our other issues. But unless we keep our democracy, we're not going to be able to successfully address any of our other issues. So I think it is the core primary thing, all of us, whatever we care about, democracy first, and then whatever else, climate, whatever we want to do, we can do along with it. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Brad, George.
Thank you.
That brings us to a close for today, everyone. You're welcome to the after session chat group. You'll see the link in the chat that Stan's put in. Good day, everyone. See you tomorrow. Bye for now.